Well, a very, very good morning to you as the G20 Leaders Summit, the first one on the African continent, is expected to start at the Nasrec Expo Center in Johannesburg in just 2 hours' time. Gathered under the theme Solidarity, Equality and Sustainability, the summit will discuss debt reduction for low-income countries, mobilizing finance for just transition and ensuring inclusive growth, among other issues. Over 40 heads of state and government and representatives of the G20 member states, as well as United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, are attending the two-day summit. President Cyril Ramaphosa will deliver the opening address to the summit at around about 10 o'clock this morning. Now, for an update on the G20 Leaders Summit and what's happening on the floor behind me, let's cross over to SABC News United States correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, and he, of course, is with Sakina. And I'm going to just turn around and look at them because they are right behind me, over my shoulder, here at the Expo Center. Sakina?
Hi, Leanne. So, yeah, this is where we're at. And, of course, it is D-Day, to borrow a worn-out phrase at this point, but an important day for South Africa and for the African continent as we host Africa's very first G20 Leaders Summit. But, of course, this has been dotted with a whole lot of summit sideshows, if you will, but not sideshows, and that's the wrong word, because these are important conversations. The building blocks, that's a better word, to make up what we ultimately will walk away from here in Johannesburg. And speaking of, the theme of this particular summit, if we look at solidarity, equality, sustainability, those are more than just words. Those are not just phrases that we want to regurgitate, because they need to find expression.
Because the agenda is a global agenda, when you talk about climate change, when you talk about economic and macroeconomic stability, when you deal with issues of poverty and food security and gender equality or water and sanitation, it doesn't only affect South Africa, it doesn't only affect Africa. And so the multilateral system has recognized that to move forward, you need to move forward as a collective. And I think you've heard that from the EU, you've heard that from Emmanuel Macron, and you've heard that from a number of leaders that have landed in South Africa, asserting the consensus-driven nature of how we solve these problems together. Unilateralism, unfortunately, does not work when there's a global financial crisis. Unilateralism doesn't work when you're trying to implement a development agenda that is so broad that affects millions of people. When you have migration and displacement due to climate catastrophe, when you see the data that says the Earth's temperature is rising above 1.5 degrees, and with that comes consequences that are going to be so detrimental. That's why you talk about disaster risk reduction. That's why you have to undergird yourself and fortify yourself for a future. But poor countries can't do that alone. Poor countries need bigger countries that are most responsible for the climate catastrophe that is impending to play their part, Sakina, to play their part in terms of the common but differentiated responsibilities. I did more to create this problem. I have greater responsibility to pay for the solution. And so that's what this is about. This is about working together as a collective. Yes, as sovereign states, we often don't agree with everything, right? But where are the compromises? Where do we find each other? And can we implement those together and then figure out how we disagree or agree to disagree? And this is what South Africa has done here. They have been criticized by countries like the United States, but they have focused on the ball. They have been criticized sometimes around misinformation, but they have focused on what they can achieve here. They've tried to include the country that has been criticizing them the most. They've decided not to be here, and so South Africa now saying, how do we as a collective move forward with or despite the United States?
I tell you, let's walk and talk, because that is so critical, Sherwin. If we take, for example, the burden when we talk about the just energy transition, as you say, Africa, we know, contributes less than 4% of those global greenhouse emissions. But we look at what Africa still needs. You have more than 600 million African households that do not have electricity. That just energy transition is not just a platitude. It's not just a catchphrase. It is something that actually means something to the people who are directly affected by it.
It's not just pie in the sky. And to ensure that that pie is baked really well, you need money. You need money to ensure that you can invest in communities, because countries, especially in Africa, have a high debt burden, and often they're not very wealthy. And so the question about this this multilateral forum known as the G20 is, how do you find and capacitate these countries to deal with these intractable issues like electricity, like infrastructure, when you talk about trade in Africa, when you talk about the Africa continental free trade area, to what extent do we have the logistics to implement intra-Africa trade? It's not yet there. Ports, railways, shipping. That kind of infrastructure, visa, the ease of doing business. These are things that we really need to grapple with. They also talk about singular currencies in the SADC or the AU. I mean, where is that conversation today, and how does it influence where we go from here? So it's about money, it's about helping countries, it's about that's what solidarity is. How are we going to ensure that countries that don't have electricity today but are paying more on their debt repayments than investing in health and education can do better? And this is what the Secretary General and I were talking about yesterday in terms of the role of multilateral banks, in terms of concessional financing. How do we lower the cost of money? Why is money so expensive?
But again, it's more than just the talk, because who's in the room? Who is here? It is the biggest economies. It is also the multilateral institutions through representation of the UN Secretary General and others, the EU representation. Those who are owed are in the room. Those who are owing are in the room.
Yeah, it's not all bad news, right? I mean, there are. I mean, if you look at the EU and you talk about just energy transition in the South African context, they've invested about 11.3, or that's the broad agreement, $11.3 trillion. So there are countries, there are blocs that are walking the talk, right? The EU is certainly showing a different perspective to perhaps what the United States is doing. You are seeing a different perspective from China. How can Africa move together? How can they ensure that the critical minerals in terms of beneficiation and this just transition actually benefits the communities where those magnets and those raw materials, the lithiums and the coppers and the cobalts that you were talking about earlier are extracted from? How do you create supply chains that are going to infuse those communities with progress? I mean, this is a conference not about the dignitaries that are in this room or the media that is gathered here, but it is about an outcome document that needs to be implemented at scale and to really influence and change people's lives on the ground, Sakina. Otherwise, what are we doing here?
And that's it, isn't it? Because the critical minerals, if we look at where Africa sits in this regard, but to borrow a phrase from someone earlier in the week, we need to move away from the pit to the port and beneficiate right here on African soil. And that's a conversation to be had, because electricity, for one, if you look at the smelters, they will tell you that 2/3 of their budget almost goes to electricity costs. That's how exorbitant it is at this moment, and some have shut down. So these are serious conversations.
So as much as you talk about the lack of perhaps of Africa investment in these things, you see the big countries, the developed world, move forward. The question is, what does that balance look like? It's not to say the developed world cannot come and invest here. It's not that the EU mustn't bring their money and invest in mining and that kind of stuff. The question is, how does it then benefit the communities there? What does that deal making look like? How can it support Africa's infrastructure? How can that deal, embellish where South Africa goes in terms of extracting minerals, or Africa, and in terms of intra-Africa trade? So we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. But at the end of the day, we will have an outcome document, whether the US acquiesces or not. The question then becomes, how do you implement those agreements? The diplomats will always say to you, we've done our job. We've done our job. We got to an agreement. We have an outcome document. There it is, and there's a pathway to what we need to achieve. Then it's up. Then you exit left the diplomats, get the bureaucrats out of the way. It's about implementation. What is the role of private sector? What is the role of local municipalities? What is the role of citizens and civil society and media? We all have a responsibility. What lessons have we learned from the lack of implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted in a document in 2015 by all 193 member states? And we're sitting at 35% implementation. We have the blueprint. Now we're going to have another blueprint. Wat gaan ons dan doen? What are we going to do then?
Because at some point we need to move away from the rhetoric. And this is where Sherwin says, we need to know who we are, what our responsibilities are, and how we actually hold power accountable and make sure that those outcomes in the declarations are actually implemented. Because if they're not, then what is all of this in aid of? We need to move the needle. And how do we move that needle? This is where all of us become instrumental. But of course, we're going to hand it back to studio.